There was a time, not so long ago, when many faithful Catholics looked around and barely recognized their church. They saw rainbow flags hanging beside crucifixes. They heard priests speak more about climate change than Christ. They watched as gender ideology crept into homilies, as confusion replaced clarity, and as bishops debated whether sin was still sin. And at the center of it all stood Pope Francis, a man who, time and again, chose ambiguity over boldness. When asked about homosexuality, he famously shrugged and said, "Who am I to judge?" When questions arose about same-sex unions, he flirted with civil endorsement. When the world demanded clarity, he offered compromise. The faithful watched in silence. Many wept. Others turned away, not from Christ, but from a church that no longer spoke like him. But just when it seemed like the flood of confusion might never end, something unexpected happened. God raised up a lion. His name is Pope Leo XIV, and from the very moment of his election, he began to shake the foundations that had been softened for years. He didn't step into power with vague statements or gentle half-promises. He didn't smile for the cameras and mumble about listening and discernment. No. He stood before the entire diplomatic corps of the Vatican and spoke with fire, the kind of fire the prophets carried. These were his words. Marriage, according to the Church, is and must remain the stable union between a man and a woman. And then he made it even clearer. This traditional understanding forms the basis of family and is essential for a harmonious and peaceful civil society. He didn't apologize. He didn't add a footnote. He didn't hedge his words with political sensitivity. He declared the truth. Plain, sharp, unflinching. This wasn't just about marriage. This was about the soul of the Church and the direction she would take in a world that calls darkness light and lies compassion. Pope Francis gave the world soft whispers. Pope Leo gave it a roar. While the world was still applauding the Vatican's so-called blessings for same-sex couples, Pope Leo stood tall and slammed the door shut. He didn't condemn people, but he did condemn the lie. He made it clear that while every soul deserves compassion, not every lifestyle deserves validation. And if that wasn't bold enough, this wasn't a private opinion shared in a quiet corner. This was his first act as Pope. This was his opening declaration to the world. A message that said, the confusion ends now, because the truth does not evolve. The gospel doesn't update for modern trends. And the Church, the real Church, doesn't bend to the spirit of the age. Now ask yourself this. If that's what Pope Leo said on day one, if that's how he began his mission, then what else is he ready to confront? What else is he prepared to restore? Because let's be honest, Pope Francis opened the window to chaos. But Pope Leo just slammed it shut, bolted it tight, and threw away the key. If you, like so many others, have been wondering if anyone would ever stand up again, if anyone in the Church would ever call out this madness for what it truly is, stop wondering. The lion has arrived. And in the next chapter, you're going to see how this man, Robert Francis Prevost, was preparing for this very moment all along, even while the Church was slipping into heresy in broad daylight. So don't go anywhere, because what you're about to hear next will change the way you see everything. Robert Prevost wasn't part of the inner circle. He didn't appear on the shortlists. He wasn't being groomed by liberal cardinals or photographed next to celebrity bishops. And yet the man who just took the chair of St. Peter had been quietly watching the collapse unfold for years. Robert Francis Prevost spent his life far from the Vatican stage lights. While others made headlines by pushing the Church to adapt, he was serving the poor in Peru, not as a political player, but as a missionary priest who believed that truth doesn't change just because society does. He wasn't tweeting theological sound bites. He wasn't organizing interfaith conferences with rainbow lanyards. He was in the slums, in the parishes, in the quiet corners of the Church where the gospel still carried weight. And while the hierarchy in Rome crafted statements so vague they could mean anything, Prevost remained anchored to what had always been true. He didn't need attention, and he didn't chase it. But he was paying attention. He watched as bishops stopped calling sin by its name. He listened as church leaders adopted language that sounded more like politicians than pastors. He observed quietly as Pope Francis gave the world what it wanted to hear: softer rules, blurred lines, and the ever-popular, "Who am I to judge?" And through it all, Prevost said little, but not because he was indifferent, because he was discerning, because he knew the time would come when someone would have to speak clearly again, without fear of backlash or media scorn. Because while others were updating doctrine to match the headlines, he was preparing to stand in direct contrast to all of it. He didn't climb through the ranks by playing politics. He rose because no one else was willing to carry the weight of conviction. And this isn't some overnight transformation. What he believes now is what he's always believed. His convictions weren't born in response to cultural trends. They were formed long before most Catholics even knew his name. There's a reason he didn't join the public debates. There's a reason he didn't try to correct the noise with noise of his own. He wasn't reacting. He was waiting, not passively, but deliberately. Because the church didn't need another diplomat. It needed someone who still believed in moral absolutes. Someone who saw what was coming and prepared to meet it without blinking. That's why this story doesn't start with his papacy. It started long before, in silence, in discipline, in unshakable belief. And the world is just now finding out what that kind of faith looks like when it finally takes the microphone. They didn't think anyone would speak up. They thought they had silenced every voice of truth, that the church had finally been tamed, and that all the real men had either gone soft or gone silent. But they didn't count on Robert Prevost. Long before he was pope, back when no one knew his name and he had nothing to gain, he stood up in a room full of weak men in collars and told the truth, not in whispers, not behind closed doors, but loud enough that every bishop in that room had to look him in the eye and decide whether they still had a soul left or not. He didn't talk in riddles. He didn't speak in circles. He didn't use fancy language to hide behind. He stood there and said it plain. Mass media is extraordinarily effective in making people feel sorry for things that go against the gospel: abortion, homosexual lifestyle, euthanasia. He didn't say, might go against. He didn't say, could be misunderstood. He said it's wrong. Period. And then, as if that wasn't bold enough, he took it even further. He looked straight at the lie the world had swallowed whole and said, media shows families with 2 dads or 2 moms and adopted kids like it's normal, sweet, and harmless. But this goes directly against what the church teaches. He didn't care what the newspapers would say. He wasn't trying to sound modern or get claps from the left. He was telling the truth, because someone had to. And what did the bishops do after hearing this? Nothing. No applause. No support. No courage. They sat there, quiet, spineless, hoping no one would notice. They swept it under the rug, left it out of the headlines, and prayed the world would forget. And for a while they did. Because at that time, Prevost was just another name to them. He had no power, no spotlight, no way to force anyone to listen. But now the man they ignored is the Pope. And the words they buried are now the words of the man sitting on the throne of Peter. The same bishops who rolled their eyes at him back then are now bowing in front of him. And those same words, the ones they hoped would be forgotten, are echoing through the church louder than ever. He didn't say those things to get attention. He said them because they were true. And that's why they were dangerous. Liberal Catholics, fake priests, and rainbow flag bishops don't fear hate. They fear clarity. They fear someone standing up and saying, no, that's wrong. That's not love. That's not of God. And now, the man who says that without flinching is leading the church. This isn't about changing the church. It's about bringing her back. Back to truth. Back to order. Back to God. They tried to erase what he said. They tried to pretend he didn't exist. Now they're shaking because he's wearing the white, and he's just getting started. They thought they had time. For years, the progressives inside the church moved with quiet confidence, slowly reshaping doctrine through soft language, careful footnotes, and media applause. They believed the next pope would be like the last, someone who talked about mercy but refused to draw clear lines, someone who kept the gates open while pretending nothing had changed. But then came a name they didn't expect: Robert Francis Prevost. The room changed when it was announced. What had been quiet strategy turned into visible panic. This wasn't the candidate of the Synod planners, the journalists, or the global elite. This was a man who had once said, clearly and publicly, that abortion, homosexual behavior, and gender ideology were destroying the soul of the West, and he wasn't just quoting tradition. He meant it. They hoped he would soften, that wearing the white cassock might tame his convictions, that the pressure of global leadership might silence the fire they had once ignored. But they were wrong, because the moment he stepped forward as Pope Leo XIV, it became obvious that he hadn't changed. The world had, and he was now in a position to confront it. He didn't open with vague phrases about pastoral accompaniment. He didn't ask for more time to reflect. He gave the Church and the world a direct, unmistakable reminder of what the faith actually teaches. He said, "Marriage, according to the Church, is and must remain the stable union between a man and a woman." He didn't leave room for reinterpretation. There was no attempt to satisfy both sides. This wasn't politics. It was doctrine, and it stood like stone. He followed it with something even stronger, a full defense of human life, not just with sentiment, but with obligation. Respect for human dignity demands protecting all human life, especially the most vulnerable among us, from the unborn to the elderly, from the sick to migrants and those who suffer exclusion. No one can be exempt from this duty. This wasn't a compromise. It was a mission statement. The message was clear: the Church isn't here to blend in with the world. It's here to confront it. And under Pope Leo, that confrontation had begun. No clever slogans, no polished soundbites, just the voice of a man who had waited his entire life for the chance to say exactly what needed to be said, and now had the full authority to say it. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't wait for applause. He stood where so many had fallen silent and spoke with the strength of someone who no longer needed to be careful. This wasn't the election they had planned. It wasn't the result the media wanted. But it was the one the Church needed. And now that it's happened, the spell is broken, and the truth is no longer hiding. You didn't have to be a theologian to see the problem. Under Pope Francis, the Church started talking like a college diversity office. One day it was pastoral accompaniment. The next it was discernment of complex realities. And by the end, no one could tell the difference between mercy and surrender. He gave speeches that sounded deep, until you realized they didn't actually say anything. He called for dialogue, then refused to answer the questions that mattered. And when it came to sin, he rarely named it, only nodded at it from a distance, like it was too fragile to touch. Then came Fiducia Supplicans, a Vatican document so soaked in rainbow ink you could smell the glitter through the pages. It didn't declare anything openly. Of course, that would have been honest. Instead, it wrapped itself in soft phrases and theological fog, blessing same-sex couples without ever using the word marriage, while claiming nothing had changed, even as the entire tone shifted overnight. It was the spiritual version of a used car salesman saying, "This isn't a new doctrine, it's just a fresh perspective." Repeat button and you could almost hear the whisper behind it all. Don't worry, it's still the same Church, just with a few more colors. They tried to spin it as inclusive, a way to reach people on the margins. But what they really did was blur the line between the sacred and the sinful so badly, even faithful Catholics started to wonder if anything still mattered. One meme said it best: Vatican blessings, now available in 6 rainbow flavors. And for once, it wasn't a joke. It felt like the Church had been hijacked, not by outsiders, but by men in collars who wanted to turn the body of Christ into a PR brand. But then, everything changed. Because when Pope Leo XIV took the throne, the mood shifted fast. He didn't need to argue. He didn't debate. He just said clearly, "Marriage is the stable union between a man and a woman. Full stop. No footnotes. No soft edges. No loopholes. Just the raw, unapologetic truth. And with one sentence, he broke the spell. It was like fresh air rushing into a room that had been sealed shut for years. You could feel the panic ripple through the bishops who had just spent the last decade redefining words like blessing and welcome to mean whatever keeps us out of trouble. But Leo didn't care about pleasing the press. He didn't care about avoiding conflict. He came to fix what had been broken. And the first thing he brought back was clarity. And there was something beautiful in that. Not just righteous, but healing. Because for too long, faithful Catholics had been gaslit by their own leaders, told that truth was too harsh, doctrine too rigid, morality too offensive. But Pope Leo didn't whisper. He roared. And suddenly it became clear that all the noise before him had been nothing more than cover for weakness. Now the silence was over, and the battle had begun. Repeat button, and just when you thought that was strong, then came the gender stuff. And what Leo said next made Fiducia Supplicans look like a bedtime story. So buckle up. It's about to get real. There are moments when someone says something so clear, so honest, so far outside the rules of polite society, that the world pretends it never happened, not because it was wrong, but because it cut too deep. In 2016, long before Robert Prevost wore white, long before anyone called him Pope Leo, he stood in Peru as a bishop and said something that no one in power wanted to hear, something that instantly separated him from the cowardice that had infected so much of church leadership. The Peruvian government was pushing gender theory into public schools, programs that told little children they could be born in the wrong body, that being male or female was just a social construct, something you choose like picking a shirt from a closet. And while most bishops stayed quiet or issued soft statements full of vague concern, Robert Prevost didn't hesitate. He looked at the lie, straight on, and said, "Gender ideology creates confusion because it seeks to invent genders that do not exist. Not, might not exist. Not, could be problematic." He said they don't exist, because they don't. There was no need for nuance. No footnote about modern anthropology. Just truth. He didn't just reject the policy. He rejected the spirit behind it, the destructive, godless ideology that tells children they are mistakes, that their bodies are wrong, that truth is fluid, and that creation itself is up for debate. This wasn't a debate about social norms. It was spiritual warfare, because gender ideology doesn't just confuse. It destroys. It breaks the connection between body and soul, between God's design and human identity. It tells young boys that being masculine is toxic, and tells young girls that femininity is just a feeling, something you can trade away if it gets too uncomfortable. And while the media cheered it on, and weak bishops called for dialogue, Leo called it what it was, a lie from the pit of hell dressed in the language of inclusion. He didn't explain it away. He crushed it. Because this wasn't about language. It was about the soul of the next generation. Repeat button, they told us that our kids were assigned male or female, as if creation were a clerical error. But Leo said no, they were designed by God, on purpose, with purpose. And anyone who tries to undo that is not offering freedom, they're doing violence to reality. He didn't shout. He didn't campaign. He just told the truth so clearly, they didn't know what to do with it. And that's exactly why he's dangerous to the people in power now. Because Leo doesn't fight with buzzwords or PR teams. He fights with truth. And when he named gender ideology for what it is, he didn't just win an argument. He exposed the entire foundation of progressive theology as a fraud. It's not compassion. It's confusion. And confusion leads people away from God. Leo didn't let it slide. He didn't talk about pastoral listening. He stood in front of a system built on lies and told it to its face, "You are not real." Repeat button, and if you think that was bold, wait until you hear what he says about abortion. Because when it comes to life and death, Pope Leo doesn't just speak clearly. He speaks like a man who knows he will answer to God. Some things aren't complicated. Some things don't need a round table or a panel, or a Vatican document 3 years in the making. And for Pope Leo, the value of human life has never been up for debate. Not in theory, not in politics, not even when the culture shouted in his face. Because while other leaders danced around the issue, rewording their convictions to sound more palatable to the world, Leo was marching in the streets, side by side with pro-life Catholics, holding signs, praying rosaries, standing in the heat, the noise, the mockery, and doing it with joy. He wasn't writing long essays about balancing priorities or understanding modern challenges. He was posting one simple message over and over again. We must always defend human life. He shared it on social media. He spoke it at events. He lived it long before anyone called him Your Holiness. This wasn't a talking point. It was his mission. Back in 2015, while serving as Bishop of Chiclayo in Peru, he joined Peru's March for Life, not as a guest of honor, not as a distant figure, but as a priest among the people. He didn't make it about him. He made it about the unborn, the ones who never get a headline, the ones who never get a voice. Years later, in 2017, he shared a homily from Cardinal Dolan ahead of the March for Life in Washington, doubling down on the same message. Life begins at conception, and no civilized society can call itself moral while it kills its most innocent. And then, as Pope, he didn't slow down. In one of his very first major addresses, he laid it all out with perfect clarity. No legalese, no softened tone, no compromise. He said, "Respect for human dignity demands protecting all human life, especially the most vulnerable among us, from the unborn to the elderly, from the sick to migrants and those who suffer exclusion. No one can be exempt from this duty." Let that sink in. He didn't just mention the unborn as a line on a list. He made it the foundation of the entire moral law. He didn't suggest life matters. He commanded that it be defended. And in that moment, something settled deep in the hearts of Catholics who had been waiting for a leader to speak this clearly again. For years, they had watched Pope Francis use vague language, calling abortion wrong, but often surrounded by so many soft phrases that it felt like the edge had been dulled. They heard him compare it to hiring a hitman, only to turn around and praise global leaders who fund it. They saw the headlines and wondered where the clarity went. But now they hear Leo, and there's no confusion, no mixed message, no wink to the media. Just truth, spoken plainly, like it used to be. And for every grandmother praying her rosary in silence, for every young dad walking in a pro-life march with his children, for every woman who regrets her abortion and wondered if the church still believed in forgiveness, Pope Leo's voice is a thunderclap of hope. It's the sound of a man who isn't speaking to win favor. He's speaking because he still fears God. And for once, the church doesn't sound like a focus group. It sounds like a shepherd. Repeat button, which brings us to the fun part, the liberal meltdown. Because the second Leo started speaking this clearly, the ones who built their careers on compromise started to panic. And trust me, the reaction was everything you hoped it would be. It didn't take long. The moment Pope Leo XIV started speaking the truth out loud, clearly, without apology, without softening it for the world's approval, the usual crowd started foaming at the mouth. You could see it in the headlines. Dangerous new pope threatens inclusivity. Pope Leo pushes church backwards with anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. American pope brings culture war to the Vatican. Social media lit up like a bonfire. Progressive Catholics tweeting in full panic mode. Activists crying about how unsafe they felt. Liberal theologians calling him divisive, rigid, and out of touch with modern society. Good. Because when people who celebrates and start hating a pope, that's how you know something holy is happening again. They wanted another Francis, soft, friendly, always ready to bend the truth just enough to avoid conflict. Instead, they got Leo. And Leo doesn't bend. He speaks with fire. He governs with backbone. He doesn't check in with CNN before telling the world what sin is. And best of all, he's American. For the first time in history, the man on the throne of St. Peter, the one holding the keys to the church, doesn't just speak truth, He speaks it in a way that hits home for every blue-collar, Bible-believing, no-nonsense Catholic who's been ignored and mocked for the last 10 years. He doesn't dress it up in vague terms. He doesn't try to impress intellectual elites. He speaks like a man raised in a country where freedom still means something, and where truth isn't just a theory, it's a fight worth dying for. That's why they hate him, because he doesn't owe them anything. He's not a product of their system. He's not trying to be invited to their events or be liked by their friends. He came from outside their machine, and now he's in charge. And here's the best part, he's just getting started. Every day that passes, he's showing us who he really is, not just a conservative pope, but a faithful one. Not just a man of tradition, but a man with a spine. And every time he speaks, it becomes more obvious. He's not going to fold. He's not going to play nice. He's not going to be manipulated by the same agenda that gutted the church for a generation. There's a real hope growing, the kind we haven't felt in a long time. That this pope, this unexpected, unwanted, unbending American pope, might just be the one we've been praying for. That he won't change once the pressure builds. That he won't soften when the media comes for him. That he won't trade truth for peace, or conviction for applause. That he'll keep speaking like this, loudly, clearly, fearlessly, no matter who hates him. Because in times like this, we don't need another smiling diplomat. We need a warrior. And thanks to the grace of God, that's exactly what we have. They've already started attacking him. The headlines are piling up, the progressive voices are getting louder, and the same people who spent the last 10 years twisting the church into something unrecognizable are now panicking, because the man they hoped would never rise has taken the highest seat of authority and has no interest in following their script. After everything we've seen, the confusion, the silence, the endless compromise under Pope Francis, the election of Leo XIV feels like something bigger than just a change in leadership. It feels like a correction. Like a course being set back on track after years of drifting toward the edge. And for the first time in a very long time, we don't just feel anger or frustration, we feel hope. Because this time, it's different. We're not listening to another politician in a white robe trying to please everyone. We're hearing a man speak like the church still has a spine. We're watching a pope who isn't afraid to be hated by the world, who isn't watering down the gospel to keep peace with activists, and who doesn't seem interested in apologizing for what the church has always taught. He's American, yes, but that's not what matters most. What matters is that he still believes in truth, not as a vague idea, but as something worth fighting for, even when it costs you everything. And when you look at how he's spoken about marriage, about gender, about life, you can tell this is not someone who is going to change just because the pressure increases. He was like this before he had power. And now that he has it, he's not backing down. But we have to be honest with ourselves. As strong as he is, as bold and refreshing as this moment is, Leo isn't going to fix the church by himself. He can't. He was never supposed to. Because the damage that's been done over the years didn't happen overnight. And it didn't just come from the top. It came from silence, from fear, from the faithful keeping their heads down while the wolves took over. If we want this moment to last, if we want this to be more than just a brief spark of courage before the machine grinds it back into silence, then we have to do our part. We have to stop waiting for someone else to fix it. Because Leo may be the beginning, but we are the ones who decide what happens next. This is the time to return to tradition without shame, to raise children who know what is true and good and holy, to speak clearly in our homes, in our churches, in our communities, not with hatred, but with strength. To stop apologizing for believing what the church has always taught and to stop pretending that silence is a virtue. The church has been sick for a long time. Now we finally see signs of healing. But healing doesn't happen through one man alone. It happens when people hear the truth again and respond. Pope Leo XIV is not just a moment. He's a signal, a reminder that we are not powerless, that the faith hasn't disappeared, and that God still raises up leaders when his people cry out. He is the first domino, but the future of the church doesn't rest on him. It rests on all of us who still believe. So stand up, speak clearly, live without fear. Because the lion has roared, and it's our turn to follow. If you've been watching this and thinking, finally, someone is standing up for the truth again, then you're not alone. If Pope Leo reminds you of the kind of church you grew up with, strong, clear, and faithful, then let others know they're not the only ones who still believe. Click the like button if you support what he's doing. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing voices that aren't afraid to speak plainly. And if you believe God gave us Pope Leo for this exact moment in history, write in the comments, "I stand with Pope Leo," because the more of us who speak up, the stronger this gets. And right now, the church needs strong people more than ever.